Welcome to Fractal Focus, the podcast where innovation meets entrepreneurship. Welcome to this special Fractal Focus podcast episode. My name is Phillip Lorenzo, and I'm with FYC Labs and with the Fractal Group. And today we have an awesome guest. And we're going to be relaxing, talking about a variable of things and the state of tech in today's society. And my guest to do that is Sedale Turbovsky. And I'm going to let him introduce himself, and I'm going to caution and context everybody on this podcast. We're kind of in this wide space with these moon pods, and there's people moving in and out. So if you hear background noise, forgive us. But this is the place that we want to have this conversation and really get into a few things. So with that said, Sedale, please introduce yourself to the world.
Thank you, Phil. Super excited to chat with you about this stuff. I am a serial entrepreneur and founder. I currently am also engaged as a brand ambassador and brand advocate at Fractal Group. And I'm super excited to chat about the journey I've been on. But the last 15 years, I've really been focused on the intersection of public and private sector data and the tools that you can build out of that. So the last company and where I'm currently working is a company called Open Grants, where we blend private data about companies and connect them to grant funding. But before that, I worked on companies that blended public data and private sector data about agriculture and helped farmers. I worked on a company called Carbon Blue, where we blended private fleet data and public data about incentives to help people deploy alternative fuels and advanced vehicle tech. So I'm excited to chat about that journey because I have spent a lot of time thinking about what it means to work with the government and work with tech. And I'm a big fan of building things that democratize access to resources. So that's me in a nutshell.
It feels like technology is the perfect avenue to democratize resource. Because if we think about the internet and the ubiquitousness of it, the availability, right, for people, if we think about the purpose of the internet in the first place when it was created, it was for connection, right? So if you, in a few words, can tell me what have been the biggest accomplishments and challenges that you've had in navigating that space and that synergy, and I hate that word, but I have to use it because it makes sense, between public and private interests and goals, et cetera?
I think the biggest challenge that we've had, and I'll start with that because the accomplishments are interesting, but I think the challenges are way more interesting. And the biggest challenge that we've had in building anything has been that, technology often, when people invest in tech companies or when we talk about building technology, I think there's frequently a failure to account for the human part of the equation. And that's always been the challenge. Like if there's a through line into, 15 plus years of building SaaS and tech companies, it's the human equation is always challenging. And whether that's that, the people who are in charge aren't really incentivized to use your platform or aren't incentivized to solve problems that you think should be solved or that people think should be solved. It's always people at the end of the day that is not only the challenge, but I think also the opportunity. And I'll say that, to the corollary to that is that our biggest successes have come from bringing and really understanding that human element and providing a solution that actually solves for the thing that people are looking to solve for, which is not always as obvious as you'd think it should be.
Yeah, I would imagine that there is so much detangling interests, inherent goals, agendas stepping into any type of partnership like this, right? That for the most effective path forward, there has to be so much compromise. And I'd imagine you've had so much experience being exposed to that compromise or lack thereof. And so in a few words or in as many words as you like, can you tell us about navigating that side of it?
Yeah, I think, for example, with Open Grants, what we wanted to do was build a common app for grant funding. So there would be a lot of transparency and visibility on both sides of the aisle people deploying capital could see the people who were looking for capital and easily connect with them and deploy capital to them. And the thing that we didn't account for is that a bunch of people who deploy capital don't want to see all that stuff, and they don't want those people to see them. And the more we unpacked it, we realized that while there were places that had incentives, the government in particular, to deploy capital, there's plenty of folks within philanthropy who just didn't want to for a bunch of different reasons. But most of them involved that they just didn't want to be bothered. And so that is a place to navigate. And what we ended up doing, what we're currently piloting, and I'm super excited, we'll be launching this towards the end of the year in Philadelphia at Blackbaud's user conference, which is going to be super exciting. But we're building an integration that kind of enables an interstitial space. Because what happened was the people who were deploying capital said, yeah, we kind of like that idea, but we don't really want those people to see us. And so we built kind of a barrier, like an in-between spot. And so that's really cool. And we hope that it'll lead to a lot more philanthropy money being deployed more efficiently. But yeah, it was a weird compromise that we had to work out where we're like, oh, they want it, but they don't really want it to be super visible. So we got to do a little bit of adjusting in how we're approaching it.
And do you think that those common barriers or those guardrails that philanthropists set up in the face of technology, in your experience, does it come from a place of misunderstanding what technology can do? Does it come from a place of distrust in general of the people behind certain technological solutions? And I think, of course, about humans being humans and responding to news pieces and articles and news stories about tech founders and all of that around it. So I'm curious as to, where is that barrier of resistance, or is it purely just privacy? I just don't want anybody to know that I'm giving away this much money for a certain cause.
I think it's mostly privacy. There's definitely distrust of technology, in particular in that space, which is a whole different, I think, kind of a different discussion. But in this case, it's just very much about privacy. They're like, yeah, we don't want to show that to people. I'm like, okay.
That's it. Yeah, conversation's over.
Yep, the end of conversation. It's like, you have the money, so I guess you get to set the terms. Yeah.
So in the time that we are in right now, which is, I believe, today is February 20th, 2025, when we're recording this episode, we are currently a full month into a new administration that has, for the first time, to my knowledge, had a leader in technology be at the forefront of government movement, of government efficiency. Forgive that word, because I know that we're leading into that territory, but I'm curious as to that all of a sudden propping of someone in the technology space, now in front and center in government. How do you, as someone with experience of marrying public and private interests together to create good things, where do you think this kind of partnership is going to go as we look into the future, and how does it affect the work that you do specifically?
Yeah, I think, I want to say something which I have been reflecting on a lot. And I think that, this new kind of paradigm that's being established looks a lot like what I would have done as like a brand new person in GovTech, which is to say that I think that now, as having been spent more than 10 years in the space, I would approach it a much more different way. But it does seem like, it seems like someone who has worked in tech their whole life, just following kind of like their gut about what they think, remaking this government should be. So where's that? First of all, it's certainly impacting, our work with grants and my work in general, just because government for so long has been this very stable institution. Just from like a capitalism standpoint, it's always been like, oh, we can back government stuff because the government will pay its bills. And that has been called into question, certainly. And so there's been this chilling effect around working with government. And because a lot of what I do is working with government, that's been, it's definitely put put a damper on things. But I hope, and my like optimism, hopes that what we arrive at here is the critiques that this current administration has offered about government, I think are fair and accurate, which is to say that it's inefficient. I think we all know that it's inefficient. And so fixing that at its core is wonderful. And that's a great mission to be on. And, figuring out how to do it in perhaps a way that doesn't dampen the economy and make sure that we're doing it in an intelligent way. I think that's the next step. But yeah, there's a lot to unpack on this one.
I think there is. And ultimately, the biggest thing that we may be thinking about in the unpacking of that is the source of funds for good work. The source of funds and where does it come from, right? So in the case of a grant, you write up a grant, you get the report ready, you submit it to a committee, the committee reviews it depending on what the nonprofit is or if it's an actual government agency, and then they come with an approval or denial, right? So if in fact we're looking at a shift in how we look for funds altogether, because typically a lot of nonprofits use a mix of government funded and non-government funded sources. Mm-hmm. So if I'm an arts institution, for example, I'm looking at the National Arts Education government committee, and then I'm looking at private funded work. So it's like that is going to be affected. That shift is going to kind of affect the regulation of grant writers, of people in executive director positions, and how they look at their fiscal budgets and where they can potentially get their money from. That was a long way to ask or to kind of get your read on. We think about state level, right? When federal programs are spun down, often the response is, well, we want the states to handle X, right? So if the Department of Education gets dissolved, states are responsible for their education is the pitch. So do you think in the work that you do, would that shift also the focus of the software that you build to say, okay, this is going to be at a state by state level, and how does that affect the product launch, for example? Because it's far easier to launch open grants when there's a federal database of grants available. And now if that's not available and you have to go on state level, now we have state by state approval. So I want your thoughts on that and if that's even the right way to think about it.
Yeah, I think that on one hand, perhaps it is the right way to think about it in the sense that there probably will be a big shift into like state spending, and there may be a lot more decisions from states about how to spend and what to spend. At the same time, I don't really think that many of the big federal programs that are domestic will entirely go away. I think there's definitely going to be some reprioritizing and shifting, but I think one of the things that has like struck fear in people's hearts, but also honestly, to my thinking, kind of made a lot of sense. Well, there's actually two things I'll mention. One is the reality of like IRA, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act, and what it actually did to support, let's just talk about EV charging infrastructure, for example.
Yeah.
The reality of those programs is that a lot of that money got sucked into big kind of special interest groups. Mm-hmm. It didn't really get deployed to support charging infrastructure anywhere. And it was so slow. And what we have to thank for charging infrastructure in most parts of the United States is private industry building charging infrastructure. And so on that front, I think that what is happening now may not only shift like where we look for funding and grants, but it also may actually give the industries the punch they need to try to move away more efficiently from government subsidies and grants. That said, big programs like USAID going away do fundamentally like shift the value proposition of something like open grants that tracks that stuff at the federal level. And I think that luckily we've done a pretty good job building also integrations at the state level and working with partners on even local stuff. So we're pretty well prepared for that. But I think the bigger question is like, are those programs going to be around and at what level? And I think really where it comes down to, like, I honestly don't see like the federal government budget shifting in terms of like where they're spending money as much as how much money is going to get spent and kind of what's allowed in terms of what you're going to do with that money.
Yeah.
And I think it's a whole different discussion. Oh, and that's specifically when it comes to grants. It's a whole different discussion when we talk about like all the different people that are getting fired and so forth. But like when it comes to grants, those are hard programs domestically to ignore because they're really significant for economic development on the ground. Whereas programs like USAID are a little bit easier to like do away with because they're not domestic. There's no congressional district for Kenya, right? And so unfortunately, it's pretty easy to like say bye to those programs because there's no people in Congress who are really incentivized to do one thing or another with them.
Right.
There's like a moral sort of thing to talk about for sure, but like, you know, the folks in the incentive is like, oh, I want to get voted back into office, and no one, you know, in your district is going to complain about USAID that much or that loudly.
You mentioned morals, and this is a really fascinating topic for me, which is always going to be about the challenges of proposing a technological solution and to come from it, because often, of course, the proposal of any app is we're going to change the world, or we're going to change the way you do blank. At a fundamental level, when you propose that, there is a degree of morality or there is a degree of human empathy, perhaps, depending on what solution you're proposing, right? And so my question to you is, how much of a balance of morality versus revenue and versus being able to sustain said business or sustain said partnerships in order to make things effective? Where does that balance for you as a founder, for you as someone who has worked with different agencies and companies and these solutions, where does that tie in, and how does that leak into conversations about solving problems, about getting budgets done, about getting things done? Because it's easy for us to go into the hamster wheel of routine or the hamster wheel of the process of a thing. And it's hard to, and you could, I'll ask for forgiveness if this is not true, but it's hard to really step back at times from that routine when you're in it to look at it from that 50,000 foot horizon and say, okay, what are the moral implications, if any, of what we're doing?
Yeah.
Even if the path or even if the goal is altruistic and it is meant for a good cause.
Yeah, I think now more than ever, it's really important to think through those things. But I spent a lot of time, I dropped out of school, but my favorite thing in school was economics. And one of my favorite things that, you know, I love to like just think about a lot was this idea of like these externalities, these sort of outsized impacts you can have without intentionally doing them. And I think, you know, right now, the goal is to play the capitalism game. And I don't think you can get away from that with any real, like, and be a serious sort of person in this space. Mm-hmm. Because that's what it is. This is the capitalism game. And I think there's a whole discussion to be had about whether or not that's a good game or not, and whether or not we should have a different sort of game to be playing. Yeah. But I set all that aside because, like, what I would say and what I think is like, okay, we're playing the capitalism game. That's what we're doing. I'm not going to try to play some other game because this is the game that I've bought into. And, you know, I'll leave it to other smarter people to think about the other kinds of ways that they can tackle that. But what I think is fun is within the capitalism framework, there's very interesting and compelling ways to do things that don't harm people. And there's really smart and innovative and interesting ways to create good in the world while making money. And I think one of the coolest things is that as we have developed more technology, there's a very interesting kind of technology-enabled ways to do this super efficiently. And so one of the first things that we did at Open Grants was we fractionalized some of our cap tables so that bounty hunters, bug bounty hunters, as well as people who contributed data to our platform could actually own some of Open Grants, so that the day that it becomes $1 billion company, they get compensated for how they've contributed. And we did that at the height of like the crypto was like pumping. It was 2020. There was money everywhere, and everything got funded all the time, and it was beautiful. It was a beautiful time in Silicon Valley, and when we did that, we did it more because crypto was super high and everyone was doing DAOs and everything else. But now, in the face of AI and agentic workflows and conversations about whether or not we'll even all be working in 5 years, it seems more relevant than ever that this kind of like fractionalized ownership and shared equity is an interesting approach in the capitalist lens to navigating this stuff in a responsible way. But yeah, I do, as a founder, I think it not only is our goal, but like for me, I think it's more about also the survival of the company, right? Like I watched Uber and Lyft get taken to court in California. And that was wild. And then the whole time it was happening, I was like, you know what? If the CEOs at Uber and Lyft had decided to just fractionalize some equity and make it liquid through tokenization for their employees, they would never have been in court. This is about protecting your business. And it's like, this is a smart move as a capitalist. I want to create $1 billion company. I also don't want to have peasants beating down my door, not to use the word peasants, but you get like, that's just a metaphor, right? But like, I don't want that situation. That sounds awful. And I don't want to get sued. It seems like an investment that you can make for fairly low cost to really help people who are contributing. And I think that the alternative is like revolution, right? Like a very like eat the rich sort of thing. So I think you got two options, and I just think like there's a smart way to go, and then there's a way where you gotta like either board up the walls and keep the hordes away, or or share and be smart, and like it's not going to cut into your profit. Like the profit margins of these companies is insane. Like it's not going to cut into your profit margin that much.
Yeah,
and it does seem worth it, and I think especially as we think about AI and how it's replacing work and people, it seems like the way to go is to figure out ways to share that wealth, even if you're not necessarily sharing the means of production, figuring out ways to support labor and folks who are contributing their data or whatever.
It's a thing that I think about with shareholder activism. Sometimes there's shareholder activism for more profit at all costs. And then there's other times there's shareholder activism, aka Costco, right? That kept DEI initiatives regardless of the trend of spinning those down, where the shareholders stepped up and said, no, we think DEI is important. That's a very optical thing perhaps, but I wonder if shareholders, and this is tough because a lot of shareholders are not individual shareholders going to meetings. A lot of time it's the hedge fund manager, it's the management companies of these funds that actually participate in those stockholder meetings. But I also imagine it would be a mix of that and also, keeping the hordes away, for lack of a better word, because there will be a requirement, I think, at some degree for shareholder participation in this, right?
And I have to say, I didn't mean to use that metaphor, but I do think...
No, but it's valid. That's
there's
the
a relevance,
thing they would say.
There's a relevance to it for sure. And I also think it's really interesting that like I know plenty of people who would be more than happy with that, right? Like I think that one of the traps that capitalism or people who are leaders and business leaders think themselves into is that like that other people have the same ambitions they do. And that's just not true. Like some people just want to do their thing, clock in, clock out, or not clock in and clock out, and they just want to live their life and chill and smoke weed all day or whatever it is. And like, there's plenty of people who, if you said, "Hey, I want you to be the CEO," they'd be like, "F that, no." Like that sounds terrible. And I think that you get that in your head that like you're like, "Oh, everyone wants to be the CEO." It's like no one wants. Like people don't want that. Like I love, I have a lot of different like sort of groups in my life of people, and I like spending time with different folks because you do get you get in your little bubble of being a founder or CEO.
Yeah.
But then I go spend time with other people who are just yeah, we just want to float on the river all day. And I'm oh yeah, that's also a way to live life, is just float on the river all day. And so I think that there's enough different people in the world, and there's enough money and resources in the world where you can have a capitalist system where you're still getting profits, you're still having shareholder activism to the extent they even want to be engaged.
Yeah.
And you still are getting work done, and there's not an uprising because some people don't have enough.
There's so much we can talk about. This episode won't nearly pack what we've earned through this conversation. We can talk about this for, I think, 4 hours and be, still without resolution to a degree. So what are your main milestones or goals that you have for this year? And it kind of reflects a little bit what we talked about so far, but what are you thinking about wanting to accomplish this year, especially thinking about the topic of navigating this new space of tech and philanthropy and granting and public-private partnerships? Where are you at?
Yeah, one of the things I'm most excited about is that I've been excited about this for years as I've watched, I just think my very first company, I had to go get an attorney who I paid 10 grand to or something to incorporate it, and then had to go to a bank to get, an account. It was just awful. And now you can spin up a whole Delaware C Corp with stock and everything else for $500, and it takes you 3 days to get your EIN, and you can get a bank account in minutes. The time it takes now to create something that can impact the world and change people's lives is you could do it in a weekend, perhaps, right? It's very possible to ship something to market that can make money in a pair of days. And then it's even more possible to build the actual infrastructure of the company alongside it. And so again, you can get something out there in weeks. And what I am particularly excited about for this year is that there are all of a sudden a whole new pool of talent that's been fired from the government. And while I think that's probably sad and shocking for them, I don't think it's the worst thing that could happen to them. And I do while I don't agree with some of the methods and other things that the current administration is doing, I do agree that government is too big and too inefficient to really function in a society that is technology enabled the way we are now. And my co-founder at Open Grants and I actually wrote a piece about this, about how there's significant threats from dictatorships, places like China, that can move because they can make unilateral decisions so much more efficiently than a democracy. And what I'm excited about and what I'm interested in investing in and seeing grow is people building tech that can make democracy function in an agile way. So things like direct voting, things like direct, paying taxes efficiently. All these, there's so much opportunity. And now you don't need to raise $5 million and find a bunch of engineers to do that, right? You can just do it. It's so cool. So I am cautiously optimistic and hopeful that the people who are losing their jobs or the people who find themselves outside of government now suddenly can take all their learnings and all that knowledge and help us build tooling that makes democracy work in the modern world. We should have direct voting. Yeah. It doesn't make sense that we do things the way we do. And a lot of the reason we do them the way that we have is simply because we've always done them that way, which is the worst decision to it's a terrible decision to make for that reason. And so I'm excited about that. And I think that is there's the two sides of the coin. We can either do really evil, terrible things. It's always a double-edged sword with technology, but hopefully we can also do amazing things and build stuff that ensures that the democratic process and the ideals of democracy can carry on and operate, but that they can operate in an agile and efficient way.
And so I'm going to play devil's advocate for one tiny moment, although everything you said makes a lot of sense. But the counter argument is always going to be, especially from experienced veteran government officials, checks and balance. You're always going to hear that, right? Where it's like, hey, if something is efficient, quote unquote, where is the check along each point? And so that's very relevant right now. And my question to you is, if someone were to approach you with that argument, what would be your potential response? And again, this is very situational, so we don't know how that would be addressed to you, but what would you think about if someone were to say, hey, yeah, great that it's efficient, but who's making those decisions along the line and in that process?
Yeah, I think that is a great argument and something that is like a flag to put in the ground. But I also think that the way that government has functioned has been so inefficient.
Yeah.
That even bringing some efficiency to it will have gains while you can maintain those checks and balances.
Yeah.
Now, there's a whole different discussion we had about politics and so forth, but functionally, things like direct voting, for example, still present, those checks and balances, especially if you're still auditing that process, right?
Yeah.
So I do think on the one hand, yeah, if you made if we have a minority report situation, right? I think that's
I don't think hopefully you don't go there.
But that's the specter, right? It's that is an example of an overly efficient process that gets hacked, and then there's a problem, right? If I'm remembering the plot correctly, that's exactly what happens.
Pretty sure, yeah.
And and so I think what people are saying when they say that there needs to be checks and balances is they're concerned about overly efficient processes like that. And I think often what we're building or what we're aspiring to in GovTech is not that. We're not aspiring to Minority Report. We're just aspiring to sort of a modern way to get your driver's license updated, right? That's what we're not we're saying, hey, let's use email. Let's not require wet ink signatures on grants. That's all we're asking for. So the low-hanging fruit is so very low-hanging that I don't think we're even close to the point where we're invalidating checks and balances with technology.
Yeah.
Now there's a whole different thing to be said about the court system get sort of outmaneuvered or what there's a bunch of politics things you can talk about, and you can talk about who are in those positions to get those checks and balances and be balanced. That's a different discussion. But from a technology standpoint, I don't think we're there to that point where we'd be in running the checks and balances.
Right. That makes perfect sense. Okay. We're at the end of our journey. We went through a lot of different places, and I imagine there might be a part 2 to this depending on response, because certainly we've covered a lot of ground. But in the interest of getting people to know you more that are just hearing you for the first time and talking about GovTech and talking about this way of thinking about the public and private sectors coming together, where can they find out more about you? I know you do amazing blogging. I know that your tentacles are so over the place. So tell people where they can find great content and also information about the things that you work on.
Yeah, the easiest place to hunt me down is probably on LinkedIn. My name is very unique. It is a combination of 2 very different cultures. So if you type in Sedale Turbovsky, you are not going to find a lot of those. So I'm easy to find there. Also, if you want to read up on some of the things I'm thinking about, like UBI and...
Yeah, we didn't get to talk about that.
Yeah, we didn't even get to talk about some of that stuff, but it is kind of related to the fractional equity stuff. So if you go to opus.foo, you can read some of the kind of thoughts that I'm having. It's also a place to just catch up on, I try to put out different meditations and other stuff there. So those are the 2 probably best places to find me. Also, you can just Google me. Again, the combination of my name is very unique. If you Google Turbovsky, you find a bunch of people. If you Google Sedale, you find a bunch of people. If you Google Sedale Turbovsky together, you're going to find me. So yeah, I'm always happy to connect. LinkedIn, I'm on all the socials, but yeah, happy to chat.
This was an amazing conversation. I personally, just so everybody understands context, every time we even get an opportunity to speak, which isn't often because we're very busy, it is always just very exciting talks. And we always try to go somewhere, I think, even in the limited time we have. And I think Kevin in the building also, we often have very interesting conversations that go to some deep places. So it is really great to be able to talk to you in this podcast forum. And what a joy. So thank you again. And for our audience, again, thank you for listening through this whole podcast. Apologies for any background noise or any echoing, but we really want to have this conversation here. And that's why I'm calling it a special episode, because it's not typically in the traditional format that we have it. But I felt that this was a great topical point to have this conversation, and a ding just tells me it's time for us to go. So that being said, remember you can listen to the other episodes of Fractal Focus on our website, and please, please, please comment, all that good stuff. And with that being said, have a successful journey in this business venture we call life. Take care. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Fractal Focus. We hope you found valuable insights. If you enjoyed the conversation and want to stay updated on the latest trends and expert advice, make sure you subscribe and leave a review. Your support helps us continue bringing you the content that drives your business forward. Until next time, keep innovating and stay ahead of the curve.